The rain came down hard that October night in New York City, drumming against the pavement like 1,000 angry fingers. Steam rose from the subway grates along Fifth Avenue, mixing with the exhaust of yellow cabs and the blur of neon signs reflected in puddles. Inside the Grand Lexington Hotel, crystal chandeliers cast warm light over men in $1,000 suits and women draped in silk, all gathered for Senator William Crawford's fundraising gala. The air smelled of expensive cologne and older money, the kind that had been passed down through generations of handshakes and closed-door deals. Elena Moretti had been working double shifts for 3 weeks straight. At 23 years old, she was saving every dollar to finish her nursing degree at Hunter College. Her hands moved efficiently between champagne flutes and silver trays, her smile polite but distant. She had learned early in this job to be invisible, to blend into the background like the classical music floating through the ballroom. Her brother Marco had helped her get this catering position, though he never told her exactly what he did for work. All she knew was that he drove expensive cars and wore suits that cost more than her monthly rent. The senator's son, Jonathan Crawford, had been drinking since the cocktail hour began. He was 28, with the kind of confidence that came not from achievement, but from never hearing the word no. His eyes had followed Elena throughout the evening, and she had felt the weight of his stare like something physical pressing against her shoulders. When she passed behind the service curtain toward the kitchen, she thought she had finally escaped his attention. She was wrong. The service hallway was dimly lit, lined with extra tables and stacked chairs, waiting for the next event. Eleanor balanced her empty tray against her hip, already thinking about the subway ride home and the textbook chapter she needed to finish before Monday. She didn't hear the footsteps behind her until it was too late. Jonathan's hand grabbed her arm, spinning her around with such force that the tray clattered to the floor. His breath reeked of bourbon and entitlement. What happened next in that narrow hallway would change the trajectory of multiple lives, though Eleanor couldn't know that, as she fought and screamed and finally went silent, her voice swallowed by the thick walls and the orchestral music bleeding through from the ballroom. When Marco Moretti received the phone call at 2 in the morning, he was sitting in a leather chair in a penthouse overlooking Central Park. Vincenzo Russo stood at the window, smoke from his Cuban cigar curling toward the ceiling. Marco's face went white as he listened to his sister's broken voice trying to explain what had happened. His hand trembled as he set down the phone. Vincenzo turned slowly, reading everything he needed to know in his bodyguard's expression. The relationship between Vincenzo and Marco went back 15 years, to a night when a teenage Marco had taken a bullet meant for Vincenzo outside a restaurant in Little Italy. The scar still marked Marco's shoulder, a permanent reminder of loyalty that ran deeper than blood. When Marco finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. His sister had been hurt, violated, and the man responsible was already protected by lawyers, police contacts, and the entire machinery of political power that money could buy. Vincenzo Russo had built his empire on 2 principles: respect and retribution. At 45 years old, he controlled half the construction contracts in New York, owned interests in legitimate businesses from shipping to real estate, and maintained the kind of network that made even federal prosecutors think twice. But beneath the tailored suits and the art collection worth millions, he remained what he had always been since growing up in the tenements of Brooklyn, a man who protected his family, and Marco's family was his family. The next morning, Elena sat in a police station in Midtown, her hands wrapped around a styrofoam cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The detective across from her had kind eyes but a tired voice. He explained with practiced gentleness that cases like hers were difficult. The senator's son had already provided a statement claiming the encounter was consensual. There were no witnesses. The hotel's security footage from that hallway had mysteriously malfunctioned. The detective didn't say what both of them knew, that justice had a price tag and Eleanor couldn't afford it. She left the station as the sun climbed over the East River, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that felt obscene against the darkness still living inside her. Marco was waiting outside, leaning against a black Mercedes. He didn't ask questions. He simply opened the car door and drove her home to her small apartment in Queens, where the sounds of the city felt suddenly too loud and too close. While Elena tried to sleep in a bedroom where the locks no longer felt like enough, Vincenzo made a series of phone calls. His voice remained calm, almost conversational, as he spoke to various individuals across the city. A banking executive who owed him a favor, a union boss who controlled the loading docks, a journalist who had been sitting on a story about campaign finance irregularities. By noon, the machinery of consequence had begun to turn, grinding slowly but inexorably towards Senator William Crawford and his untouchable son. The senator first noticed something was wrong when his chief of staff called him during lunch at the Harvard Club. 3 major donors had suddenly withdrawn their support for his upcoming re-election campaign. No explanation given, just terse emails and unreturned phone calls. Crawford dismissed it as a coincidence, though a small knot of unease had begun forming in his stomach. He had spent 30 years in politics, long enough to recognize when the winds were shifting. By evening, the situation had escalated. The senator's personal bank accounts had been frozen, pending an investigation into financial irregularities. His wife's credit cards were declined at Bergdorf Goodman. His son Jonathan called in a panic, claiming that men had been following him since he left his apartment that morning. Crawford made calls to his contacts in the police department, in City Hall, in the judicial system he had spent decades cultivating. But for the first time in his career, those calls went unanswered or were met with vague promises of looking into matters. The newspapers the next day carried a story about campaign contributions from shell corporations linked to overseas accounts. The timing was devastating, hitting just as Crawford was preparing to announce his candidacy for a higher office. His press secretary frantically scheduled damage control meetings, but the senator had begun to understand that this was not a political attack. This was something else entirely, something more personal and infinitely more dangerous. Jonathan Crawford had locked himself in his penthouse apartment overlooking the Hudson River. His father's security detail had been mysteriously reassigned, leaving him with only the building's regular doorman for protection. He paced the marble floors, jumping at every sound from the hallway, his earlier arrogance replaced by a growing terror he couldn't name. He had hurt people before and gotten away with it, protected by his father's influence and the family's ability to make problems disappear, but this time felt different. This time the walls were closing in. Marco spent those days with his sister, sitting quietly in her apartment while she tried to process what had happened. He brought her groceries, helped her file paperwork for a leave of absence from school, and said nothing about the justice system that had failed her. But Elena saw something in her brother's eyes, a darkness that hadn't been there before. She had always suspected that Marco worked for dangerous people, but she had never wanted to know the details. Now, watching him stare out her window at the street below with the intensity of a predator, she understood that the world he inhabited operated by different rules. Vincenzo moved through the city like a ghost, unseen but felt everywhere. His network of contacts stretched from the Diamond District to the docks, from Wall Street boardrooms to basement social clubs in Brooklyn, where old men played cards and remembered when the neighborhood looked different. He collected information the way other men collected art, methodically, appreciating the value of each piece and how it fit into the larger picture. He learned about Jonathan Crawford's gambling debts, his cocaine habit, his pattern of violence toward women that had been covered up at least twice before. He learned about the senator's offshore accounts, his connection to a construction fraud case, his mistress in a condo in Battery Park City. But Vincenzo wasn't interested in exposure or public humiliation. Those were tools for politicians and journalists. He dealt in a different currency, one that couldn't be bought or negotiated. He waited, patient as winter, for exactly the right moment. That moment came on a Thursday evening, 11 days after the assault. Jonathan Crawford's lawyer had arranged a meeting at a parking garage in Chelsea, claiming to have brokered a settlement with Elena that would make everything go away. Jonathan was desperate enough to believe it, eager to escape the invisible net that seemed to be tightening around him. His father had arranged for a driver, but at the last minute, the driver called in sick. Jonathan drove himself in his Porsche, hands sweating on the steering wheel, eyes checking the rear-view mirror every few seconds. The parking garage was nearly empty at 7 o'clock, the concrete levels echoing with the sound of his footsteps as he walked toward the designated meeting spot on the 3rd floor. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting shadows that seemed to move independently. Jonathan's phone showed no signal, which should have been his first warning. His second warning was the realization that he couldn't remember seeing any security cameras since he entered the structure. The black SUV appeared from behind a concrete pillar, so smoothly it seemed to materialize from the shadows themselves. Jonathan tried to run, but 2 men emerged from a service door he hadn't noticed, cutting off his escape. They moved with professional efficiency, no wasted motion, no unnecessary force. Within seconds, he was guided into the back of the vehicle, a hood placed over his head, with a gentleness that was somehow more terrifying than violence would have been. The drive lasted 20 minutes, though Jonathan lost all sense of time and direction in the darkness. When the hood was removed, he found himself in what looked like an abandoned warehouse near the waterfront. The smell of salt water and rust filled his nose. The space was vast and empty, except for a single chair in the middle of the floor, positioned under a hanging work light that created a circle of illumination in the surrounding darkness. Vincenzo Russo stepped into that circle of light like an actor taking the stage. He wore a charcoal suit, perfectly tailored, with a white shirt open at the collar. His shoes clicked against the concrete floor with each measured step. He carried no weapon that Jonathan could see, which somehow made him more frightening than if he had been armed. There was something about his stillness, the absolute control in every gesture, that communicated violence more effectively than any threat could have done. Jonathan had been tied to the chair, though the restraints weren't particularly tight. He could have struggled, could have screamed, but some instinct told him that such actions would be both futile and potentially fatal. Vincenzo produced a cigarette case from his jacket pocket, extracted a single cigarette and lit it with a gold lighter that caught the overhead light. The smoke rose slowly, creating patterns in the air between them. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Vincenzo studied Jonathan the way an art collector might examine a painting, looking for something beneath the surface. Finally, he spoke, his voice carrying a faint accent from the old neighborhood, softened by years but never quite erased. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He recounted the events of that October night with the precision of someone who had reviewed every detail. He described Elena's life, her dreams of becoming a nurse, the double shifts she worked to pay for school. He explained with almost academic detachment how the justice system had failed her, how money and influence had twisted the law into something unrecognizable. He detailed the last 11 days, every move he had made against the Crawford family empire, every pressure point he had applied with surgical precision. Jonathan's face had gone pale, sweat running down his temples despite the cool air in the warehouse. He tried to speak, to offer excuses or apologies or bribes, but Vincenzo raised a hand and the words died in his throat. There was something in the older man's eyes that transcended anger or hatred. It was colder than that, more final. It was the look of someone who had already decided the outcome and was simply following through on a foregone conclusion. Vincenzo explained in that same measured tone about loyalty and family. He described the night 15 years ago when Marco had taken a bullet for him, creating a bond that went deeper than any contract or business relationship. He spoke about honor, about the old ways that still mattered in certain circles, about debts that could only be paid in certain currencies. And he made it clear, without ever stating it directly, that Jonathan Crawford had incurred a debt that his father's money and influence couldn't satisfy. The businessman in Vincenzo, the man who had built a legitimate empire, understood that killing a senator's son would bring heat that even his considerable resources couldn't deflect. But the son of Brooklyn, the man who had grown up in a world where respect was earned through action and maintained through reputation, understood that some transgressions demanded a response that sent a message echoing through every corner of his territory. What happened in that warehouse remained between Vincenzo and Jonathan, witnessed only by shadows and the rats that scurried along the walls. But when Jonathan Crawford emerged several hours later, deposited on a street corner in the financial district as the sun rose over the East River, he was a changed man. Physically unmarked but psychologically shattered, he walked with the gait of someone who had looked into an abyss and understood that he could be dropped into it at any moment. The gold Rolex that had been on his wrist, a graduation gift from his father worth $60,000, was gone. In its place was a simple note with an address in Queens and a date 1 month in the future. The message was clear. Restitution would be required, and Vincenzo would determine both the form and the timing. Senator Crawford received a package that morning at his office in the Senate building. Inside, wrapped in the front page of the New York Times, showing the headline about his campaign finance scandal, was his son's watch. There was no note, no explanation needed. The senator sat at his desk for a long time, holding that watch, understanding with perfect clarity that he had entered a world where his influence meant nothing, where every alliance he had built over 3 decades couldn't protect him or his family from the consequences of their actions. He made the decision that powerful men often make when facing an opponent they cannot defeat. He retreated. Within a week, he announced that he would not seek re-election, citing family health concerns. His son Jonathan entered a psychiatric facility in Connecticut, supposedly for treatment of anxiety and substance abuse, though those who knew the truth understood he was hiding from something far more substantial than personal demons. The investigation into campaign finances quietly disappeared, as did several other pending matters that might have destroyed what remained of Crawford's reputation. Elena Moretti returned to her classes at Hunter College 6 weeks after that October night. The tuition for her remaining semesters had been anonymously paid in full, delivered through a scholarship foundation that Marco assured her was legitimate. She never asked questions about what had happened to Jonathan Crawford, though she read the news about the senator's retirement with a satisfaction that felt both righteous and hollow. Justice, she had learned, came in many forms, and sometimes it operated outside the courtroom. Marco continued his work for Vincenzo, that loyalty forged in blood and strengthened through crisis. But something had shifted in their relationship, a deepening of trust that went beyond professional obligation. Vincenzo had gone to war for Marco's sister, had risked the empire he had built because family meant everything. In a world of temporary alliances and negotiable loyalties, that kind of commitment was rare and precious. The warehouse near the waterfront was demolished 2 months later, making way for luxury condominiums that would sell for millions to young professionals who would never know about the drama that had unfolded in that space. The city moved on, as cities do, absorbing stories into its vast collection of secrets and forgotten histories. New scandals replaced old ones in the newspapers. New faces appeared on the society pages. The machine of power and influence continued its eternal grinding, indifferent to individual tragedies and small victories. But in certain circles, in the restaurants of Little Italy and the social clubs of Brooklyn, in the places where old men gathered to remember when the world made more sense, a story was told. It was told quietly, never with names, but everyone knew who it was about. It was a story about a powerful man's son who thought he was untouchable, and the older man who taught him that some debts could never be erased, some actions could never be forgiven, And that true power had nothing to do with money or political connections. Vincenzo Russo stood at his penthouse window on New Year's Eve, watching fireworks explode over the Hudson River. The city spread out before him like a kingdom, millions of lights representing millions of lives, each with their own stories of triumph and tragedy. He thought about Elena Moretti, whose life had been violated but not destroyed, who had found a measure of justice that the system couldn't provide. He thought about Marco, whose loyalty had been tested and proven absolute. And he thought about Jonathan Crawford, who would spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, knowing that he lived only because Vincenzo allowed it, and that permission could be revoked at any moment. The champagne in his glass caught the reflected light of the fireworks, golden and effervescent. Behind him, the penthouse was filled with associates and friends, celebrating the arrival of a new year with the kind of expensive excess that marked their world. But Vincenzo remained at the window, alone with his thoughts, satisfied with the knowledge that in a city of 8 million people, where justice was often just another commodity to be bought and sold, he had managed to deliver something that money couldn't purchase: consequence. The rain began to fall again as midnight approached, washing the streets clean, and somewhere in Queens, Elena Moretti stood on her apartment balcony, feeling the drops on her face, and thinking about second chances and the mysterious ways that protection sometimes arrived from unexpected sources. She had survived, she had endured, and though the scars remained, both visible and hidden, she understood that she had been defended by forces she didn't fully understand and could never repay. The city continued its eternal rhythm, indifferent and magnificent, holding its secrets close. This story explores the complex intersections of power, justice, and loyalty in modern New York City, showing how traditional codes of honor persist even in a world dominated by legal systems and political influence. The narrative demonstrates that some debts transcend money and that protection sometimes comes from unexpected sources. If you enjoyed this story and want to discover more tales of justice, loyalty, and the hidden power structures that shape our cities, please subscribe to the channel. Each story reveals a different facet of the human experience, exploring the moments when ordinary people face extraordinary circumstances and the choices that define their character. 3 years passed, like pages turning in a book that Elena Moretti sometimes couldn't believe was her own life. The nursing degree she had fought so hard to finish now hung framed on the wall of her small office at Mount Sinai Hospital, where she worked in the emergency department. The irony wasn't lost on her that she now spent her nights treating victims of violence, understanding their trauma in ways her textbooks never could have taught her. Her hands, which had trembled for months after that October night, now moved with steady confidence as she inserted IVs and sutured wounds and offered quiet comfort to people experiencing the worst moments of their lives. The scholarship money that had appeared mysteriously had covered more than just tuition. There had been therapy sessions with Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychologist in Brooklyn, who specialized in trauma recovery and never asked questions about who was paying the bills. Those sessions had been difficult, forcing Elena to confront memories she wanted to bury, but Dr. Chen had been patient and persistent. Slowly, painfully, Elena had begun to reclaim pieces of herself that she thought were lost forever in that hotel hallway. Marco visited every Sunday for dinner, a ritual they had maintained since childhood, but that had taken on deeper meaning after everything that happened. He never spoke about his work, and Elena never asked, but she noticed the changes in him. He was more careful now, more protective, checking the locks on her apartment door twice and scanning the street before they went anywhere together. The weight of what he had witnessed, the machinery of retribution he had set in motion with a single phone call, had marked him in subtle ways that only a sister would recognize. On one of those Sunday evenings in late spring, as cherry blossoms fell like snow outside her apartment window, Marco told her something he had kept hidden for 3 years. Vincenzo Russo wanted to meet her, not to discuss the past or ask for anything, but simply because he considered her family, and in his world, family knew each other beyond names and circumstances. Elena's first instinct was to refuse, to keep that chapter of her life closed, but something in Marco's expression made her reconsider. This wasn't just his boss making a request. This was the man who had defended her honor when the justice system failed, who had dismantled the life of someone powerful to prove that her pain mattered. The meeting took place at a small Italian restaurant in the West Village, the kind of place that had been family-owned for 4 generations, and where the menu never changed. Vincenzo arrived exactly on time, dressed simply in slacks and a navy sweater, looking more like a successful businessman than the figure who occupied so much space in her imagination. His handshake was firm but gentle, and when he smiled, the lines around his eyes suggested someone who laughed more than she expected. They spoke for 2 hours about ordinary things, her work at the hospital, his passion for Renaissance art, the changes happening in the city they both loved. He never mentioned Jonathan Crawford, or Senator Crawford, or that October night. He didn't need to. The acknowledgement lived in the spaces between words, in the respect with which he treated her, in the understanding that some debts could never be fully repaid but could be honored through continued protection. Before they parted, Vincenzo gave her a small card with a phone number written in elegant script. He explained with characteristic directness that this number would always be answered day or night if she ever needed anything. Not just safety or protection, but anything at all. A problem with a landlord, a medical school application that needed a recommendation, even just someone to talk to at 3 in the morning when the memories became too heavy. Elena took the card, understanding that she was being offered something rare and valuable, a promise of permanent sanctuary in a world that often felt dangerous and unpredictable. Jonathan Crawford, she learned through occasional news articles and Marco's carefully vague updates, had never recovered from whatever happened in that warehouse. He had moved to California, working at a non-profit organization that helped victims of violent crime, living modestly in a small apartment far from the privilege he once took for granted. Some people whispered that his transformation was genuine, born from true remorse and understanding of the harm he had caused. Others said he was simply terrified, following the terms of an agreement that kept him alive as long as he remained useful and contrite. Elena suspected the truth lay somewhere between those extremes, and ultimately, she didn't care. His fate was no longer connected to hers, except as a reminder that actions have consequences, even for those who believe themselves above accountability. Senator Crawford had died the previous winter, a heart attack in his sleep at his estate in Virginia. The obituaries praised his years of public service while carefully omitting the scandals that ended his career. Jonathan attended the funeral alone, standing apart from the other mourners, and left immediately after the ceremony. The family fortune, diminished but still substantial, was tied up in trusts and foundations, none of which Jonathan could access directly. The golden watch, that symbol of privilege and protection, had never been recovered. Elena sometimes wondered if Vincenzo kept it somewhere as a trophy or if he had melted it down, erasing its existence as thoroughly as he had erased the Crawford family's sense of invincibility. The city itself had changed in those 3 years, as cities always do. New construction blocked old views, beloved restaurants closed while trendy replacements opened, neighborhoods gentrified and transformed. But beneath the surface changes, the fundamental nature of New York remained constant. It was still a place where millions of individual stories intersected, where justice and injustice coexisted, where power could be both weapon and shield depending on who wielded it. Elena found herself thinking about fate and choice during her shifts at the hospital, watching how single moments could alter the trajectory of entire lives. A drunk driver's decision, a missed diagnosis, a violent impulse, all of it creating ripples that spread outward, touching dozens of lives in ways both visible and hidden. She had been changed by trauma, but also by the response to that trauma, by the knowledge that she mattered enough to someone that he was willing to wage war on her behalf. That knowledge had given her a kind of strength that therapy alone couldn't provide. On the third anniversary of that October night, Eleanor worked a double shift in the emergency department, treating a steady stream of patients with problems ranging from minor to critical. As dawn broke over the East River, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, identical to that morning 3 years ago, she stood on the hospital's rooftop break area, drinking terrible coffee and watching the city wake up. She thought about the girl she had been, frightened, violated, convinced that justice was only for people with money and connections. And she thought about the woman she had become, stronger, wiser, protected by an invisible network she still didn't fully understand. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. 3 years. You survived. You thrived. That matters more than anything else. Jivi. She smiled, saving the message before deleting it, understanding that even this small gesture of acknowledgement carried risks in Vincenzo's world. But he had reached out anyway, marking the anniversary not of trauma, but of resilience, reminding her that she was seen and valued. Marco called that evening, suggesting they visit their mother's grave in Queens, something they did on significant dates. As they stood together in the cemetery, surrounded by headstones marking the Italian immigrants who had built this neighborhood, Eleanor felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. Her mother had died when she was 16, too early to see her daughter become a nurse, too early to help her through the darkest period of her life. But standing there with Marco, protected by forces she didn't fully comprehend, Eleanor felt her mother's presence in the spring breeze and the flowering trees, and she knew that somehow, in ways that transcended understanding, she had been watched over all along. The story that began in violence had transformed into something more complex, a tale of loyalty, justice, and the intricate web of human connections that defines family beyond biology. Elena had learned that power came in many forms, that justice sometimes operated outside courtrooms, and that being protected didn't make you weak. It made you human. As night fell over the city, 8 million stories continued unfolding, each one precious and unique. And in that vast tapestry of human experience, Elena Moretti's thread shone brighter for having survived darkness and emerged into light, forever changed but never broken, protected by honor in a world that often forgot what honor meant.